Thank you. Well, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Sophie. A great pleasure to be here in Cardiff this evening. One of my sort of first positive personal contributions to what would we call it, sort of community relations, perhaps, was when I was walking past a row of police coaches, police buses. There was a tradition, and I expect it still occurs today, where police officers are sitting in coaches prior to being operationally deployed. This was the situation. Muslims were coming to London to demonstrate against the book, and I spotted in one police coach a copy of the offending book, and looked, it was actually sort of propped up in the window, and it seemed to me that here was a, to give him the benefit of the doubt, here was perhaps a young police officer who thought this might be amusing, let's put this book. So yes, I was able to remove the book from the window. I'm not saying that the coach windows would have been broken or anything, but that sort of personal positive contribution to community relations, I wonder now if it was outweighed by a well-meaning contribution that probably sort of prefigures the work I would do later on with the Muslim Contact Unit. That comes probably a decade later, around 9/11. But this earlier piece of work, I mean, it was well-intentioned. In many ways, I was just perhaps an agent for a wider initiative, and it's, I think, typical of the Muslim community and Muslim community leaders at the time. If I should mention names, I should probably mention the late, very well respected Dr. Zaki Badawi, who probably at that time, if anyone was the sort of, if you like, the leading voice in London, then it was probably him. And of course he was a very brave man, and here we had a problem, didn't we? The book was there. It was a deeply offensive book, probably to all Muslims, but it was there. The author clearly, under no circumstances, could the author be allowed to face what I think was quite a real threat, which, if you recall, it was probably emanating from Iran. And so there was a clear public duty there. But here, from day one, here were Muslim community leaders with very brave, bold, creative ideas about how to tackle this problem. And, as we have sort of grown accustomed to more recently, but then I think this was hugely innovative, ideas were floated. Well, look, dialogue. This is a problem that has to be solved. Is the author, is he prepared to enter into a dialogue with, responsible Muslim community leaders? Well, I have to say, and I should perhaps be limited in what I say, but there was certainly very clear goodwill on the Muslim community side. Just because of the work I was doing at the time, I was able to facilitate a meeting, if you like, between both parties. But I think it was probably ill-fated, because I think at the time, if you consider the tense politics, if you consider the sense of great hurt that was being felt because of the book, it was a meeting that was unsuccessful, and probably would have needed to be developed far more to be successful. And the reason I recall it with some, with a sense that it was negative, was because on the Muslim side, it led to a predictable problem. I think the sense that Muslim leaders were known by the wider community to have had that meeting with the author, and I think there was a a popular feeling that the offence caused by the book was such that that they shouldn't have gone ahead. But well, I think it taught me a lot. There were elements of bravery and a sort of willingness to tackle difficult issues, which is what I found a decade later when I returned to the arena as the head of a very small unit at New Scotland Yard, the Muslim Contact Unit. And then what I've done in the book is to really present it in the way of a London tube journey, to sort of try and create the sense in which we, as police officers, the way we encountered Muslim communities in that immediate post 9/11 period. And I should say that I think, with the book being published really on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, it was a good opportunity to take stock. And one of the key lessons, one of the key themes, I think, in this sort of learning process is that the evidence that I'm able to present, both from that practitioner work and then the subsequent academic work, if you like, building on the practitioner experience, is that the major myth, I mean there are several, but the major myth about Muslims in this post 9/11 world, this sort of counter-terrorist world, the myth that Muslims have not done enough to tackle the al-Qaeda problem. The myth that Muslims in this country have been in denial about the problem. I think we're able to challenge that quite strongly. What should I offer as just an example of that? I mean, there are several. I think some of the strongest examples are when we compare expectations that we have of other faith communities. I think for those of us on the Muslim Contact Unit who had worked in the field of Irish terrorism, for example, we were acutely aware that London Irish communities, London Catholic priests, for example, we were aware that there was never an expectation from government or from senior police officers that those Catholic representatives, that they should have any real detailed knowledge of the IRA problem. Occasionally in particular circumstances, of course, there would be instances where you might find that knowledge. But it seemed to me that there was always an unrealistic expectation that the wider Muslim community and representatives, that they would have some knowledge, that they should be expected to have some knowledge about this terrorist phenomenon, which really, at any point over the last 10 years, is really, I think, quite confined and is not dissimilar to other terrorist threats in other arenas. So what we found, and what I describe in the second section of the book, if you like, the tube journey going south to Brixton, is some real expertise that existed throughout the 1990s, and instead of the reality here that local Muslims were in denial, in fact, local Muslims were ahead of the game. Local Muslims in Brixton at key points in the 1990s were identifying significant threats related to al-Qaeda and related to violent extremism that, if you like, the establishment more generally would only come to recognise several years later. I mean, there's a good case in point because it's quite topical. Abu Qatada is in the news, and I don't support for 1 minute the regime by which Abu Qatada has been detained and has not faced trial for all these years. However, there's no denying the evidence that existed in key communities in London, the evidence that I present in the book, and I think it's to the credit of local Muslim communities. My focus is on London, but there is evidence around the country as well that where there's been an opportunity to have important information that is of value in this context, that often Muslims, and it's interesting, isn't it, that in the case I'm describing, the Muslims with this particular knowledge and this willingness to help have been themselves demonized. They just happen to be Salafis, you know, just like in the days of the provisional IRA, you know, the idea that Irish Catholics might be in some way suspect or guilty. So I think the tendency to demonize a particular section of the community is doubly prejudicial, because I think the evidence here is really quite clear that not only is it unfair to stigmatize a section of the community simply because it happens to share some aspect of the religion with people involved in terrorism, but more particularly it's unfair because these are individuals who have shown outstanding bravery, initiative, and resourcefulness in tackling the very problem that they are associated with. So that's a particular focus on a Salafi community. The book has perhaps an equal focus on an equally demonized section of Muslim London, the Islamists. So again, in terms of using the Victoria Line tube as a means of travel and connection, then that involves going northbound to Finsbury Park, which at the time the Muslim Contact Unit was operating was widely known as the base for Abu Hamza, perhaps the most well-known violent extremist in this arena. And it might just be useful to quote from Melanie Phillips in, I think, what was possibly, I don't know if it still is, but I think at one point this was the most well-read, top-selling book on this topic. You know, Londonistan, and I must admit, when I first thought about writing the PhD and then developing into the book, I think one of my main drivers was the thought of responding to some of the approaches in this book. Of course, it's not at all unique. Indeed, there's a parallel book, I think, which is probably even more significant, Celsius 77, written by Michael Gove, significant because there you have a present government minister and an indication of how and why the views expressed in this book and its sort of partner books, how that pejorative view of Salafis, pejorative view of Islamists, how that has come to hold sway. And let's just see what Melanie had to say about this. Yes, in the section appeasement of clerical fascism, after the London bombings in July 2005, Tony Blair appeared to have understood just what Britain was facing. He spoke of the need to confront a strain of Islam that was an evil ideology. It cannot be beaten except by confronting it, symptoms and causes, head on, without compromise and without delusion, he declared. Crucially, he recognised that the ideological component of the struggle with radical Islamism was as important as the military and operational aspects, if not even more so. He said he would close mosques that fomented hatred, vet foreign imams and outlaw extremist groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir and al-Muhajirun that are known to be ideological organisations rather than the ones with a direct connection to terrorism. By setting the ideology of radical Islamism firmly in his sights, the Prime Minister appeared to have got the point, but it was not always so. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, he had declared after a meeting a group of Muslim community leaders, what happened in America was not the work of Islamic terrorists, it was not the work of Muslim terrorists, it was the work of terrorists pure and simple. Following the American atrocities, the British government had bent over backwards to avoid saying anything that had anything to do with Islam at all. It was all to do instead with grievances, discrimination and Islamophobia. A former Foreign Office Minister, Dennis McShane, has said that he tried to push for a more hardline approach but was rebuffed because of concerns that Muslims would be offended. My generation of Labour MPs don't want to indulge in anything that smacks of Muslim typecasting or hostility, he said. It's fair to say we failed to work out an adequate political response to Islamist politics in the UK. And she goes on to describe the work that I was involved in on the Muslim Contact Unit as being part of the appeasement that has more broadly in books like Bruce Boyer's While Europe Slept, how radical Islam is destroying the West from within. You know, it's become part of an incredibly powerful narrative that I think has really, you know, touched all aspects of our work. I mean, I think in the Metropolitan Police, I think we managed to rise above that. And I look back on some of the fantastic partnership work that we did. I look back on it now sort of very mixed feelings because it was not clear at the time, it was not at all clear to us at the time that that we would be, you know, literally overtaken by this narrative, you know, whether it's Phillips, whether it's Boyer, whether it's Gove. It was not clear at all, and I guess the evidence of a new and a much stronger government approach, which is increasingly clear that, you know, politically active Muslims, Islamists, Salafis, that these are going to become outcast. I suppose we saw the first signs of that in 2006 when the government launched the Communities and Local Government Department. Ruth Kelly was a very forceful initial leader of that department, followed by Hazel Blears, and I think we began to get the new tone then. Round about the same time, we had John Reid as a new and vigorous Home Secretary. Some of you may remember when he travelled to East London to deliver messages to Muslim parents. You know, very much, I think, in line with this thinking that somehow Muslim parents were remiss, were negligent, were guilty. You know, were they not keeping an eye on their children when they lost interest in cricket, when they started to grow long beards? I mean, you know, some very very troubling messages that were conflating either strict adherence to Islam with some kind of radical threat, or alternatively conflating active political engagement with that threat. So yes, I would suggest that by 2006 we've certainly got I suppose we should call it a success really for the think tanks that were really quite proactively advocating this agenda. I mean, the most notable think tank in that category would be Policy Exchange, not least because I suppose Michael Gove, you can link both to the Policy Exchange role and then also to his later role in government, but many others as well. And I think what you can also see is an awareness on their part that they can't afford to be associated with the out and out Islamophobic advocates. Let's say the Robert Spencers of this world, what we might say, the outrageous Islamophobes, and therefore, at the same time, you can begin to see quite a careful positioning. We are attacking radical Islam, but hey, we are not Islamophobic. Look, here is the evidence. We are lining up with Muslims, and so it's at this point that we see the maybe the quite subtle promotion of groups like the Quilliam Foundation, who are in many ways there to say, yes, look, the new government policy, it's the right one. It's one that is properly focused on extremism. Well, what I try to suggest in the book is this, that that whole argument, call it the new argument of radicalization, it doesn't quite stack up. There clearly needs to be more research, but from what we can see at the moment, it really does make a huge quantum leap. I mean, even if we're looking at a group like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which clearly doesn't have much to offer in the way of community cohesion. It appears to be quite an exclusive and exclusionary group, and it might well be put in a sort of an extremist category. But even if we're looking at a group like Hizb ut-Tahrir, it really is a serious mistake to make these dramatic leaps to place them in the area of al-Qaeda related terrorism, to confuse what people think with what people do. And so the book is really quite a powerful argument against this move towards what I would have to call a counter-subversion strategy. Now, a counter-subversion strategy may well be justified if you have a communist threat, and if it's 1970 and we're in the middle of the Cold War, and if countries like Russia and countries in the Iron Curtain, if they are trying to subvert British politicians, and if if activists in Britain are working for Russia and not for Britain, well, then that sounds like the basis for a counter-subversion strategy. Obviously, one that will provoke significant argument today. But actually, where we are today is that it is Muslims, and probably at the moment, probably primarily Muslims that are put into that Islamist category, Muslims that are politically active, that are perhaps challenging the government on its policy in the Middle East generally, that are at most danger of being branded a subversive threat. I think in particular Muslim groups and individuals that can be linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's pretty clear that on Melanie Phillips' account, Michael Gove's account, the sort of wider neoconservative account, which is really quite pervasive, then here is a subversive threat. And I think the argument, and of course it's been put to me very powerfully, that this is perhaps a more serious threat than the terrorist threat, the violent extremistic threat, because it is, the argument goes, longer term, truly subversive, and you may have heard different points, the sort of argument, even someone like Tariq Ramadan, who is described as sort of ultra subversive because he has the ability to present a friendly face to non-Muslim audiences, but hey, books longer than mine have been written to try and convince people about his sinister ulterior motives. Well, it's an odd position at present, and I think my book, it's primarily focused on a period up to 2007, and I wrote a subsequent chapter to try and capture the situation last year, because it did seem to me that when David Cameron, when he spoke at the Munich Security Conference last year, it did seem to me at that point that we really had a new strategy towards sections of the Muslim community that was akin to a new counter-subversion strategy. And some commentators since then have applauded it. It must be significant, I think, when the new strategy was applauded by Policy Exchange and others, as, if you like, finally the government has woken up to their key message. It remains to be seen, I think, quite what this means in practice. I mean, I am quite optimistic. I think it's an unsustainable position, and I think the Arab Spring has probably helped to make it even more untenable. You can't really have a situation where, let's say, someone who's been granted safe haven in London over the last 20 years, who was, for the whole of that 20-year period, was branded by his home country, Tunisia, branded as a terrorist, someone who was typically tortured in Tunisia before coming to a safe haven in the UK, and then with the absolute surprise and unexpected events in Tunisia, the former dictator is now the person who is wanted by Interpol, and we have a series of refugees, long-term refugees in this country, who are now able to return to Tunisia, perhaps return to Egypt, and are occupying senior positions in those countries. And I think the government is having to rethink its position. These are individuals who were regularly appearing in the Times, particularly the Murdoch press, as terrorists. Why are we giving these people a safe haven? Well, I think one of the central messages in my book, here are characters who actually have a track record of superb voluntary citizenship in London. Not just in relation to terrorism, counter-terrorism, but in relation to a whole range of difficult areas. In Finsbury Park, assisting in some very difficult drugs problems which no one else in the community wanted to help the police with. So I think there's both international pressure, the sort of the events in and around the Middle East, which I think will continue to unfold. And I think government will eventually, I think, have to come to its senses and see that to brand, perfectly decent and perfectly reasonable citizens who may well not agree with foreign policy on a number of matters, but that these, it doesn't make any sense for Britain's interests, for Muslims in those categories to be stigmatised. And one wonders as well what sort of messages that sends out. What I would just sort of conclude with is I think the area where my current research is going, and it comes from exactly the same experience. Perhaps one of the earliest links would be this: when I went to a mosque in an outer London borough in January 2002. I went there to ask questions about al-Qaeda. The mosque management, they knew nothing about al-Qaeda, and perhaps why should they? But what they did know about was violence against Muslims. And it was only after 20 minutes of listening politely to my questions that they brought it to my attention that the mosque had been firebombed the night before, and if only I'd been a bit more of an observant detective, I would have seen the evidence myself, and that became quite a familiar experience. And as some of you will know, I've continued that interest in research terms, and I don't think we will ever fully capture the extent and nature of anti-Muslim violence over the last 10 years in this country, but it's certainly important to capture it as well as we can, because I think it's to the enormous credit of mosques and Muslim communities around the country that they've withstood at times. They've withstood some incredibly difficult scenarios, and one of the sort of typical scenarios that's come up often in research is in communities outside of London, but often not far outside London, market towns, and where even perhaps no more than 10 individuals, 10 troublemakers, causing routine vandalism at the mosque, coming into mosques and causing distress on a regular basis, through to a significant number of arson attacks. And I mean, one arson attack that I highlight in the research was in Luton, because here the mosque sustained an attack from a firebomb that contained an accelerant that was extremely well constructed. And I think it's important in the future when these attacks occur that my former police colleagues should devote sufficient resources to the investigations, because there's a benefit over and above the need to have a proper and effective investigation. But I think the cumulative impact of this kind of attack is extremely harmful, and it's important to send out positive messages, not just to reassure the victims of these kind of attacks, but also to discourage the political groups that are increasingly closely associated with campaigns of intimidation against mosques, and just to sort of bring this together, if you like, to bring the two themes together, I mean, it's absolutely no coincidence that the English Defence League sees the East London Mosque as its prime target because, you know, the English Defence League, who are not all, you know, they're not all sort of kind of thugs who don't ever read. I mean, you know, they read and they quote Melanie Phillips, you know, you name it. They get the view, and why wouldn't they get the view that it is mosques like East London Mosque that are regularly demonised as extremist, subversive, Islamist, that these are the places that they have to attack. And only 2 weeks ago they were back in a pub opposite the East London Mosque, very abusive chanting, which I think is partly to provoke Muslims into some response. So I think, you know, we have to be, I think, very alert to the potential here, and I think perhaps I would, yes, I would finish by, you know, urging perhaps perhaps a sort of greater cohesiveness amongst Muslim communities, because, you know, there was a tendency, I think, immediately after 9/11, when Muslims were being blamed across the board, you know, all Muslims are terrorists, and I think there was a tendency then in, you know, books like this one, the Vincenzo Olivetti, which I think is an assumed name, Terror Source, this tendency to say, yeah, well, it's not all Muslims, it's these Wahhabis, it's these Salafis, it's these Islamists that are the problem. And I think it's unhelpful, and I think there's always a tendency to go in that direction, to sort of, which I think is unhelpful factionalism. And what I think we had on a good day on the Muslim Contact Unit, we had Muslim police officers, some of whom had a sort of a Sufi approach to their religion. We had Muslim police officers who had a Salafi approach to their religion, and I think it's that sort of combined approach which I learnt to respect greatly when I was working with Muslims every day, both in the police service and in the community. So, yes, I'll leave it there, and you know, happy to take any questions at all. Thank you.